Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Cassie, I am the Evil Secret Ninja, and I talk about books and review books on my channel. And today I'm talking about all things fantasy. So these are the things that I like about fantasy, and the things that I don't like. And overall, I am a big fantasy fan. I love reading fantasy novels. I have to say it was a little bit hard to come up with things that I don't like, but there are some things. Probably my favorite genre. I certainly read more fantasy than I do anything else. I came up with 10 things that I like and 10 things that could be improved upon. So the things that I like, the first one is the magic. That's kind of one of the main reasons to read fantasy is all about the magic and the magic systems and the interesting and things that the authors are able to come up with. Obviously, like Brandon Sanderson, he has a magic system based on the consumption of metals. We have soft magic systems, we have hard magic systems, things that are born in you, things that you have to learn, things that make sense, and things that kind of defy all reality. I really enjoy reading different magic systems and how the author comes up with how magic works in their world. Probably one of my favorite things about fantasy is the magic. The second thing that I like about reading fantasy is the different races or mythical creatures or monsters that are being created in them. And yes, I know that often they have just regular things like wolves and mountain lions or whatever, but they also have really interesting monsters or races. Think of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and the dwarves and the elves, and those were probably one of the first ones, but obviously a lot of them are based on fairy tales, and so you have all of the fae and everything like that wrapped up in the fantasies that you read. So it's always really cool to find something cool or something different. I mean, and dragons, you can't beat dragons. Those are a big part of fantasy. The next thing that I love about reading fantasy is world building. And obviously, there's ways that world building's done that I like better than others. I kind of like I know you have to have some info dumping of world building, but it's kind of nice when it's spread out, and instead of reading chapters and chapters of world building, but had to have it spread out throughout the book so that you learn about the world as you go along. But I'm amazed at the ideas and the different things that people and the authors come up with when they're building these massive worlds, and how these worlds came to be, and how everything works in that world and how it's different from ours. The next one, the fifth one, is that there's a wide variety of stories wrapped up in fantasy. You have your grimdark, you have your political intrigue, you have military fantasy, but even more than that, you have mysteries in your fantasy, you have heist stories, I think there's even some horror in there somewhere, although I don't think I've ever read horror fantasy, but I don't doubt that it's there. So I think that there's a wide variety of stories for people who like a wide variety of different genres. I could certainly find a fantasy book that was a thriller, or that's just an adventure, or any number of things. I found that there's a lot of variety in them. And even though a lot of times, with the epic ones, there's this big battle and forces of good versus the forces of evil, but that's not the only thing that's in fantasy. There's so many other really fun things that are in fantasy. The next one, the sixth one, is these are some big books. I love big books that I can really get immersed in what's going on in the novel. I know that these are not going to be super easy, super quick reads. I have to invest some time. And if I'm really enjoying the story, it just flies by, and I feel wow, I feel so accomplished. I've read this 1,200-page book. I feel I accomplished something, and I feel so when I'm done, I get this big euphoria feeling, and I'm just I like big books because I feel there's no reason to rush at anything. You can really get into the nuances of everything, great things that we love about big books. I guess that also goes along with having series, so that there's a drawn out story, and that we see the characters' development throughout the series, and we see how the choices in one book affect the choices in another book. That's kind of really fun in a fantasy series. The next one, the seventh one, it can go both places of things I like, things I don't like. But one of the things that I like in fantasy is that, in the fantasy novels that I read and that I like, is that the romances are not like the forefront. I don't mind romance in a book. I don't like it when it takes over the whole book, and I find that in fantasy, they might be like poorly written romances. The relationships might be horrible. Thankfully, there's not enough focus on it in most cases, or in the ones that I enjoy, that it drives me crazy. The next thing that I like about fantasy is that there's a wide range, for every age group. You have middle grade fantasies like Fablehaven, and you have like young adults, and this is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, so you have all sorts of stories that are being told, and then you have adult fantasy, and obviously I think adult fantasy is my favorite, and then would be middle grade, and usually I like middle grade before young adult, mainly because of there's not near as much annoying romance in middle grade. The next one, the ninth one, is I like how a lot of fantasy, there's an exploration of kind of an issue that we're dealing with in the world, or that was dealt with in the world. Obviously, Lord of the Rings dealt with industry and the changes that industry was making in the world. Rhythm of War, the Stormlight Archives, they looked at like mental health and problems with depression and PTSD and different things, and how that affected people. Octavia Butler, she does science fiction and fantasy, and sometimes she mixes them, but hers often address issues that were related to like slavery and kind of the crazy things that happened in there, but putting it in a fantasy setting that made you look at it in a different way, and made you think about where that idea came from. And it was pretty horrific where it came from, but she was definitely could see how she was tackling the issues of slavery and different things like that. So I really like that they kind of bring in issues that are important to people. It's not just fluff reading. And the 10th thing, the thing that I enjoy about fantasy, is it's just fun to read. It's a fun adventure. It's a fun, exciting thing to read and explore. And I don't always feel like this, but I pick up a fantasy and sometimes I'm just like, wow, like that's something I've never thought of or heard of before. And it's done in a way, or they take an old idea and they put it in a way that makes it really interesting. So the fantasy authors that I like, I find that they, I just like how they tell a story, and they're a lot of fun to read. And like I said, they might be like really big books, but I feel like it takes me no time to get through them. Alright, so those are the 10 things that I like about fantasy. Now I'm going to do 10 things that I don't like so much. Probably the first one is not really something that I don't like overall. It's because I've noticed that trends are changing, and I'm really excited about trends that are changing. But obviously the first one is that the industry seems to be dominated by white men. And now as I'm exploring kind of all areas of fantasy, I know that now there's a lot more diversity, but a lot of the authors, and especially like the older authors, they kind of have a similar look to them. But I obviously, like N.K. Jemisin or Evan Winters and, R.F. Kuang, M.L. Wang, there certainly is getting to where there's a lot more diversity. Robin Hobb is obviously one that's been around for a while, and Margaret Weiss, back when it wasn't normal for there to be a female fantasy author. So I'm a little bothered that it's dominated by one specific group of people. But don't get me wrong, like some of my favorite authors are those guys. Like I really like Brandon Sanderson. I really like Robert Jordan and those guys. But I am excited to see changes. It's kind of like something I don't like, but I love seeing how much things are changing in the genre. The second one kind of goes along with that, is that a lot of times in fantasy I struggle with how women are written. First of all, why do they always have to wear dresses? Dresses are not like these comfortable things. And yet almost every fantasy novel girls are wearing dresses. You know, if you're creating an entirely new world and new something, you could think of something better for them to wear. Just saying. A lot of times, like, women are written very strangely. Some people do it okay, and some people don't. Obviously, you can tell, like, some authors actually maybe spent some time looking at what women go through and trying to write them in a way, or had people reading them and saying, oh yeah, that makes sense, I like this, the way that this female acted, or I would certainly think that way. Often they're objectified, often, you know, there is violence and certain things committed against them. And it's not like across all fantasy, but that is something that I've seen in different fantasy books and novels, books and stories that I don't like so much. The next thing that I don't like is when you get unfinished series. And I know that every author that has not finished their series has a reason why they haven't finished it, and that's fine. Sometimes it's so hard, like, waiting for those books to come out, knowing that they might never come out. You know, I wanted to have a conclusion to it. There's no conclusion. Another one, and this is just kind of like a minor annoyance. Maybe not. Maybe it's a little bit more, is their little novellas and little stories that they have between the novels. It seems like, you know, you have the story that goes along, especially like if you're picking up older fantasy and trying to find those, like, those novellas or those in-between books can be really difficult to find. It seems like every time Brandon Sanderson writes a new book, he writes 3 or 4 novellas. Like, why not just include those in the book? Put them at the end as they hear some short stories that go along with it. The extra cost of purchasing those, and sometimes they can be, like, really expensive. They'll be like 100 pages and they'll be like $15. And I'm like, that's a lot to pay for just a little teeny novella. So I don't know that I would say, like, do away with them, or I kind of like how they did it in the Chaos Walking series, where at the end of the book, they had this little story at the end of the book, so that you got the book and the novella that went along with it. So I guess I wish that it was done more like that. It's not that I don't enjoy the stories or the novellas. It's just there seems to be, like, a lot of these little, like, we'll just shove these little stories in here in between all the books. The next one isn't really like a complaint with per se for just the fantasy writing or the fantasy books or anything. It's how much, like, the fans fight over fantasy novels. You know, like, the big fans of Brandon Sanderson, like, if you say anything bad about any of his books, like, they will tear you down. You know, if you say anything bad about The Wheel of Time, the hardcore fans will let you know, like, oh, you didn't like Crossroads of Twilight? Well, there's something wrong with you. They can be so passionate that it's kind of... We all have different reading things that we enjoy about reading, and I don't think that any book is ever perfect. You know, there's always problems with every book. There's always things that I don't like the most about every book that I read, and, you know, like, that's okay, because I don't think that there's a perfect book. There's not a perfect fantasy series out there. And even though, like, some of them I really, really like, I can always find things about them that annoy me. Like, there might be a really great fantasy, and then all the women wear dresses. And I'm like, I don't understand. Like, obviously whoever wrote it does not know what it's like to wear a dress. It's not like it's comfortable. Robert Jordan was always talking about the dresses and stuff in Wheel of Time, and I thought, that does not sound comfortable. It does not sound like these women who are, like, these warriors and stuff are going to be wearing dresses that are, like, really long. The diehard fans get a little bit wrapped up in their favorite fantasy, and like I said, it's nothing against the books. It's just a book. Is it really worth all that effort to get so worked up about? The next one is kind of like the overdone tropes. So we have, like, the Resurrection Trope, the Chosen One trope, often get overdone. And so it's, you want to kill off a main character? Kill him off. Don't bring him back. Just let him die. I know that's awful, and we get invested in that hero, and it hurts us when they die, but, you know, have some... It's okay. If that person is actually really crucial and they can't die because they're the chosen one, then don't kill them and bring them back. Just pick one. You know, but there's a lot of tropes that are overdone. A lot of books that are, like, just kind of rewriting other stories, and tropes that are overdone, or books that feel like they're the same. And I know a lot of the older fantasy, they were going off of Lord of the Rings and just rewriting a lot of parts of Lord of the Rings. But then also a lot of the older books are now what's being used to inspire the newer fantasy. So the next one, was related to the one that I liked, which is I like it when the romances don't take up the whole book. What I don't like is when the romance in the story takes away from the story. I haven't seen it a whole lot. It's probably just because of the authors that I read and that kind of stuff. Like, it's not in there. I read more of the author. I seem to pick more authors where it's just, yeah, we're going to have a love story in there, but it's just like it happens because life's happening and people obviously get in relationships, so relationships happen, as opposed to we've got this great story going on and this great adventure or this great mystery or this thing that we're trying to solve, and now we're just gonna forget about that and we're gonna focus on this romance. And it could take up pages and pages or a chapter. You're like, when are we getting back to the story? Like a little romance scattered here and out is great, but sometimes it gets overwhelming where it takes away from the story and it makes me not want to continue this series. The next one is also kind of related to there. Like, I love world building in the series. I love like the expansive worlds that they come in, but sometimes like the massive amounts of info dumping can get a little bothersome. Like, I know that you have to explore things in the world, and I know that sometimes you might have to, something's going on and you're going to have to look at something a little bit so that reader understands what's going on. But having like chapters and chapters of info dumping where nothing's happening, I like it when it's more spread out. So again, like, that's not a major criticism, because I understand that you have to build up the world, and I think that when you spread it out throughout the whole book, that it works a little bit better. We're learning about the world as we're getting immersed in the story. The next one, just like kind of everybody else that I've seen that is associated with the reading fantasy, is sometimes we have the worst cover art. How come there's always a person with a weapon, with a weird pose? And there's a lot of others. There's a lot of just really bad cover art. And I know like there's all sorts of comparisons, like, ooh, let's look at, if you look at the UK covers for the Mistborn series, like, they are way cooler than the mass market paperbacks. And it's not like it's hard to come up with a good cover. Like, this has a really great cover. But sometimes they're just monstrosities. Sometimes I think that the YA books have more interesting and fun covers. Like, you don't just have to have a person on the front with a weapon. Almost like the ones better that just have a sword on the front. Just do something different. And then the last thing, and I haven't come across this a lot. I have come across it more as I've been reading David Gemmell's series. But every once in a while, you come across books that don't feel like they fit in the series. Like maybe it's like 100 years later and they have different characters, but it doesn't feel like it fits in the series. Now, it can be done really well. Like, you have Mistborn and then you have Mistborn Era 2, and you could tell that it was in the same world. But then the first trilogy wrapped up really well. So it was like you couldn't follow the same characters because of how it ended. And so to make another series in the world with different characters made sense. But a lot of times, like with David Gemmell stuff, all the books that I've read so far have like the same plot and it's in the same place, but it feels like it's kind of disconnected from the other books that I read in the series. I don't know if this is like a common thing, if this is something that I'm just learning about, but I am finding that sometimes I come across it. There's just a book that doesn't fit, and it's part of a series, and it just doesn't feel like it is part of the series. Actually, I enjoy these books. They're fine. It's just sometimes it feels like they're not really connected to each other. Right, so those are the things that I like or don't like about reading fantasy. And like I said, I love reading fantasy overall. It's probably my favorite genre. It's the one I read the most often. There's just a lot of things that I really enjoy, and there's some things that really are kind of annoying about fantasy. So thank you all for watching. Please, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.